Welcome back to the Structural Reasons podcast. My name is Nikki. I'm your host. Today we're going to discuss things such as is Shengwu Li an overrated debater? What it's like to debate with your mom? And we're going to continue this so interesting gold conversation in competitive debating. This has been a great conversation with Tejas. He's an amazing person, an economics student from Stanford, and somebody who has great insights into the debating community, and someone who we might call a rising star. Before I leave you to the episode, please consider subscribing, following us, engaging with us so we know that you care, you know that we're in your thoughts, and we continue doing what we are doing. We're gonna have great conversations lined up here. So let us know who you would like to hear next. What questions do you want to ask debaters from throughout history? What questions do you want to ask debaters that are still competing currently? Let us know. We are listening. 2019 World Schools Champion. That's a big deal. Then you go on to top speak and win the USBP Nationals. You are a finalist at top speaker of Oxford IV. You are the night best speaker and made the quarterfinals of, I believe, your first WUDC, which was quite the achievement. And the biggest achievement of them all, you were, in fact, the top speaker and a semifinalist of the Structural Reasons last year. So it's great to have you on the show. Welcome. How do you feel?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. This podcast is super cool, by the way. Debaters are like interesting random people.
I'm happy. I'm happy you enjoy it. It is the podcast for debaters from debaters. So I want to start off with something more interesting. Of course, we're gonna talk about you in depth, but what does it mean to flip an argument?
uh, well, I always think of rebuttal as having like two forms. Well, three forms in theory, or like there are three ways you can rebut an argument. The ideal is you take an argument and you prove it false in 100% of cases. But that's almost impossible. So imagine like someone's arguing that, I don't know, legalizing drugs would fight the black market. Like you can give like 25 reasons why it won't, but that doesn't defeat it in every single case. Like there will always be one case where this like one black market drug supplier didn't exist. So the second way and the more realistic way is you mitigate an argument, right? You say like, vast majority of cases this is not true. So let's weigh this against our own argument. And the reason I like often like to resort to like flipping an argument instead is flipping an argument is like trying to say they make the problem worse. So that way, you don't actually have to prove that their argument is false in every single case. If you can prove that in more cases than not, the opposite of their argument is true, or it's an argument for your side rather than an argument for their side. So in my mind, it's just like a good way of thinking about whether, you know, various attempts at solving problems in the real world can kind of backfire and go much, much worse. I do it. My degree is in economics, and in economics, there's often this talk of like the Cobra effect, which is like whenever you do a policy, like policies have unintended consequences, where you're trying to solve a problem, but then you end up making the problem worse. And the reason it's called the Cobra effect is apparently there was this policy where people were like, if you give me like there was a problem of like cobras biting farmers and killing them. I think in colonial India, and so some official was like, well, I want to incentivize you to kill cobra. So if you bring me a dead body of a cobra, I'll pay you money for it. But that led to more cobras rather than less because people bred their own cobras, killed a couple, sent them to the government, and released the rest. So yeah.
I see. So in the debate world, you're quite famous for flipping arguments, but I guess other people also flipped arguments at certain points. What do you think made you kind of famous for specifically that? Do you do it in a different way than other people, or was it not as popular before you?
Uh, so I have two theories. One of them is um, I kind of like say the word flip when I'm flipping an argument, which a lot of people don't do. And the purpose of it is just to like let the judge know, like this is what is happening to the argument in the debate, or like kind of like describe what is happening as if I was a third party or something. Like flipping arguments is super common. So I'm not sure why I was spotlighted for it. And then the other thing is, I think it's often like a very big fraction of my rebuttal. Like I do, it's often the majority of responses that I end up giving. One of the reasons why is um, in world schools, which is the background that I began with, usually a second speaker would have, and this is also true of VP, of course, but usually a second speaker would have an argument of their own at the end, and they would do a bunch of rebuttal first. They would get to the argument, and the argument at the end that the second speaker has in world schools is often an attempt to basically flip the other side, and it's the argument that they have at the end. And then in BP, it's 7 minutes. It's difficult to find the time to ensure you have the argument at the end. It's a little less rigid. Like judges aren't expecting you to have the argument at the end. So what often ends up happening with me is I just take that argument and put it into, existing buckets of rebuttal that I'm doing or something.
I see. I think this is an interesting segue to kind of look around what happened with your world schools years. But before we go into that, I kind of want to know about you before debating. So, what were you like when you were little? What did you want to become when you grow up?
Yeah. When I was super young, my like number one. So I was like when I was like in kindergarten or something. I got this like one book called 50 Easy Ways Kids Can Help Animals. It was in 2007. Um, and from that point, across like different iterations of things that I've been doing, I've been super interested in like animals and helping them and animal welfare, that kind of thing. So I started off wanting to become a herpetologist. That's someone who studies reptiles. Like I used to like know like the taxonomy of like hundreds of different reptiles. There's this like crocodile zoo slash research center in Chennai, which is like where I live. And I used to like volunteer there. I was like the youngest volunteer or something. And in middle school, I think at some point, and like how I got into debate is something like, well, maybe that's off topic, but yeah, broadly, I wanted to become a herpetologist. I was super into animal welfare. Even now, I'm super into animal welfare, although in a completely different way. Yeah. So I would say that's the main thing that like defined me.
Have you been able to translate this knowledge into debates? Is there an interesting point of view that you have on this house with Banzos?
Yeah, animal welfare motions are my favorite. Like I probably shouldn't be saying this, but like I set them at every tournament where I CA. Like, spoiler alert! Like if you're going to a tournament I'm CAing, good chance this is a topic area you should maybe prep for. Of course, I may surprise you and end up not setting one just to waste your time. But yeah, um, I've actually only done one animal welfare motion at a tournament and at a university tournament. I like just they're not very common, I guess. And unfortunately, that was the lowest score I've ever received in a BP round. I don't know what happened. So to this day, if you like bucket all my topic areas by like, the scores that I've received, the lowest, like I think I got like a 74 or something, was in an animal welfare round. I never had the opportunity to change that. But yeah, I think a lot about animal welfare, about arguments related to animal welfare. I actually like made this lecture session thing on YouTube for World School. It was targeted at schools debaters on debating animal welfare. Um, I think it's the only workshop of this nature that I've done because it's the only thing like I felt confident I knew how to talk about. On this house would ban zoos. Um, I feel like a somewhat underrated argument on this topic. Well, I have like two somewhat strange arguments on this topic that I think are like quite underrated. So, from the proposition on this house would ban zoos from Gov, I feel like one of the biggest real world effects of zoos on animal welfare that people don't talk about is you have to feed the animals in zoos. And that often happens in like, so you often carnivores, right? And the way you procure meat for zoos often happens in like pretty inhumane ways, because it's like, you don't care about spending money on the food that you procure. And like sometimes animals have pretty specific needs. So for example, like raising and then feeding live mice to snakes is like fairly common, not just in zoos, but in things like school laboratories and so on. And there's actually been research done on, the scale of like literally rearing mice to feed snakes. And it's often like they live pretty bad lives. And then the much more like boring thing is like sometimes animals are just fed like human meat, like they're fed like factory farmed meat, like, they're just fed like chicken or something. Um, and if you just think about it objectively, like you're thinking about animal welfare, like the very normal meat purchased at a grocery store and fed to an animal in a zoo might actually be a bigger impact of zoos on animal welfare than anything that happens to the animals inside the zoo. But we don't talk about it because it's just human meat, right? It's just pretty normal. But if you just think about the number of animals that are affected, the lives that they go through, and so on, just like going to a store, buying chicken or beef or something to feed to an animal at a zoo, which is common practice, by the way. They are often fed like human meat, not the meat of humans, meat that humans eat. Um, and that's possibly one of the like biggest ethical implications about zoos. And then on the other side, I feel like on the side against people banning zoos, I feel like in general, when thinking about animal welfare, people don't think enough about like what the counterfactual world for the animal is. And in a zoo, there are like two pretty plausible, realistic alternatives for an animal in a zoo. Either they are taken from the wild. This is probably like a minority of animals in zoos. They're just like taken from the wild. And in that case, you can just argue that life in a zoo, even if it's bad, even if it's abusive, is probably way better than life in the wild, which is often pretty awful for a lot of animals, right? And then the other is a lot of animals are bred in zoos. So you first capture, say, a couple of tigers from the wild or something, and then you run a breeding program in the zoo to ensure your zoo has many generations of tigers. So in many cases, the alternative for an animal in a zoo is not existing at all. So I feel like when making arguments about like whether animals are treated well in zoos, that kind of question, it's worth considering whether they are treated so badly that it would be better for them to not even exist. Difficult philosophical question, but maybe not explored enough.
Fair enough. So obviously, like this is emotion that everybody knows, but what is a really good animal welfare motion?
Uh, so I've set a lot of them myself. A lot of them are the ones that I remember that like I made. So let me think of like animal welfare motions that others made. So one motion that I really like is basically, should animal advocates emphasize the effects of meat on health and the environment, or should they emphasize its effects on animals? And should they try to like, bring up empathy for animals? And I think that's like a really interesting topic. It's a topic that, animal welfare groups struggle with in the real world. Like a lot of like animal advocacy organizations that I've worked with have actually thought and like done research on thinking about which strategy is more effective. Another like pretty common but good one is, this is actually the first tournament final I ever went to. I was like 14, a school's tournament. Is like, should you require meat packaging to have like labels that have images of suffering animals, basically? Um, I also think that's like a pretty interesting topic. In terms of ones I've set, probably my favorite one that I've set is, I set this at a school's tournament. Is, as an individual animal advocate, should you work on a mainstream organization aimed at improving the welfare of animals on farms, or should you instead join one of the new organizations that's working on improving animal welfare for wild animals? For example, treating sick and injured animals or feeding them, or, they're doing work on contraception, basically like to reduce overpopulation among pigeons, for example. They're thinking about putting contraceptives into pigeon feed. This is different than conservation, right? So conservation, saving endangered species is very common. But when you're protecting endangered species, your goal isn't to help the animals. Your goal is to increase the population of the species, right? So in many cases, that might be good or bad for animals. For example, if wolves in a particular forest are threatening an endangered species, many conservationists are willing to shoot the wolves. And the difference is, there is a very burgeoning, very small set of new organizations rising that are specifically focused on improving the welfare of animals in the wild, especially small animals like frogs, for example. Because the thing about small animals like frogs is they have these reproductive strategies where basically they have a lot of offspring and only a small percent survive, and everyone else dies a painful death. And so, ways to like mitigate that, very hard for humans to get involved in the wild. There are all sorts of like third order effects. But yeah, that's a motion I've set that I'm like reasonably proud of.
Okay, before this becomes a animal podcast, I'll ask one simple last animal question before we move on, because it is very interesting to me. What animal would you be and why?
Maybe like a dog in a home. That seems okay. That seems like a reasonably good life.
You're very pragmatic on the issue, but
It's
fair
true.
enough. Maybe because you know about different struggles in the wild, we are domesticated animals as well. Okay, so I guess it's interesting. How did you get into debating in the first place, and how did you perceive it back then?
Yeah. This is a kind of funny story. Well, there's like two different elements to it. So the first is in middle school, some teacher told me I should try debating because some essay of mine apparently sounded like a debate argument, and I said sure. But the thing is, my school, especially in middle school, but also in high school, had this internal debating format, like this debate format. It wasn't real debate. Um, and the thing about it is, they would try to mimic a lot of the elements of parliamentary debate. For example, they would have this house believes that at the start of topics, but it was really funny. Like 15% of your points were for humor, and the topics were often like completely ridiculous. So, a real example of a topic that my school said is this house believes that money talks, but when it does, it only says bye bye. Real topic, completely real. And all the topics were like this, right? But I thought like the teacher told me to go into it, so I did. I auditioned for the middle school debate event. My school had this internal debate event. I failed the audition, right? I was in seventh grade or something. And then I was like pretty frustrated that I failed the audition. So I went home, and what I did is I created an account on this website called debate.org. It doesn't exist anymore. And a lot of people have seen this website, but they've seen this section which is like questions and answers. But if you log in and you become a member of the website, you realize that there's like a debate section where people literally do like they type out an argument, you wait 24 hours, then the other side responds, and so on. It's like proper 3 rounds, 1v1 debate with evidence. Now, most of it is horrible, but there used to be some people on there who did like a lot of debating in American high schools. So the Lincoln Douglas format or the policy format or public forum, which are these like fairly evidence based technical formats. Like like public forum is the least technical of them, and everyone speaks like faster than any VP debater today. And it's the least technical, right? Um, but this was all text based. So I spent like 2 years basically. Almost every day, I would spend like 3 4 hours on that website. I did like 140 debates. I learned to do like these really detailed like research investigations, or like I used to like learned to read studies off that website. I used to watch a lot of like American high school debate videos. And I used to think, yeah, American high school debate is the best. And I used to feel like pretty bad because I only had my school's format, which is like the least technical format you can possibly imagine, right? And then in around ninth grade, there was my school held this session for a world schools competition that was happening in the city. The session was held by Hemant, who was in my school, later went to Harvard, was a successful debater. Um, and in that session, the thing which I recall most like distinctly is at some point they used the word fiat. And the thing about fiat is fiat as a concept exists in American high school debate as well. It means the same thing. And so I heard the word fiat and I was like, I know that word from debate.org. And so I was like, maybe I should pursue this whole world schools debate thing. And then I did. Yeah. That's the story. I spent so much time on that website. Yeah.
Well, what year was that actually? That's interesting. Kind of get a timeline of events.
I think it was 2015 to 2016.
2015, 2016. That's interesting. This is so while Bosel was making his speech, you were sitting there somewhere typing on the debate.org,
It's true.
learning about fiat and reading a bunch of stuff. That's great to hear. So when did you start debating in real life? I feel like you went through a small COVID of your own with like learning to debate
Yeah.
online, and then you kind of entered the real world arena with the newfounded skills and worse fiat.
Yeah. I started debating like in real life around 2017. Um, so the first ever competition I went to was in April 2017. It was ICED, the International Competition for Young Debaters. It's held every year by Oxford or Cambridge. And a non-profit in India funded me. Like I obviously couldn't afford to go there. But the Indian Schools Debating Society, which is the one which selects Team India and so on, they ran a selection and I got selected, and then I got to go there. Yeah, that's the very first tournament I attended in April 2017.
How did you get selected for something? Is it very competitive?
Uh so there was just a selection event from like in Chennai where I lived. So my school and other schools in the city were invited to it. So it was like sort of like they just did a bunch of BP rounds. It wasn't a tournament, but they explained to us what the BP format is, and they did a bunch of BP debate rounds. And then I think the team that performed best at that like selection mini competition got selected to go to the UK.
So when do you get to the Team India of World Schools, and was it a obvious process, or did you was it hard at the beginning? How did that go?
Yeah. So the process was simple, right? In the sense that the nonprofit ISDS contacts like a bunch of schools across the country. They do like a bunch of selection rounds. They do a selection in your city, then they do like a zonal selection. And then the top 48 also are invited to a national selection from which they pick the five. So this was around the same time. Like I got selected in April. Um, it was like the process was not complicated, but it was very difficult to get in. Like it was a lot of debating and a lot of work. um to this day I'm not 100% certain how I got in. um I think, yeah, I had some good speeches at the national selection, but I also had some really bad speeches, including many speeches where I did not make time. But yeah, somehow I got selected. And then yeah, from that point I got like a lot better because it was like world class coaching for free, right? Like there's nothing more you can ask for. Yeah.
W- Was there somebody helping you before you got to the team, or somebody who motivated you? Did you have a friend or a parent?
Yeah, so I would say I had like a couple of sources of support. The biggest one was Hemant, who I mentioned earlier. So Hemant was like my first coach. They were just like 2 years ahead of me in high school. They taught me what debating was like. They had been on Team India before by this point, and I think Hemant is the person who has been on Team India the most times out of anyone in India. And they were always there and always like super supportive. They're still super supportive and are one of my closest friends. Um, the other is, so my mom has this story. I don't know whether to believe her, but this is her story. Where she basically says she didn't actually take it seriously. But she was supportive with me, but she just thought it was just like another minor thing or like another school competition or something. And the thing she always regrets is that she let me wear a t-shirt that she hated. This is her biggest regret. um and then when I got to the team, right, she didn't realize, like she says she didn't realize like it was significant or anything. But then there were these like big posts on social media that got like thousands of likes and stuff. And so I appeared on her feed wearing the t-shirt that she hated, and she was like, wow, this is actually a big deal. and she has been like so supportive with me since. In fact, even like helped me work really hard. So in the period before my first competition, I said, and that January, I would give a debate speech every day in front of her. So I would just prep for 15 minutes and give a PM speech in front of her. She would set the topic and then she would judge me. And like obviously she knows nothing about debating or anything, but she's a smart person, but she knows completely nothing about debating. But she would just set topics that interested her. Sometimes they would be debate topics, sometimes they would be like from the newspaper. And yeah, so every single day from like about January to April, I did that. That did help. I mean, I was very bad, but it did help. And since then, she's like, you know, like in 2019, she had to hear the news on a phone call that I was in Thailand at a world championship having broken my ankle because I like fell down from a bus and I broke my ankle and like I was in a wheelchair the whole tournament. And she just was completely chill. She was like, I mean, any parent would panic, right? And like that's the example of support that really, yeah, blazes in my mind. She didn't panic. She was just helpful. Yeah.
Well, I mean, your mom seems like a great person. So, which is it more nerve wracking? Open quarterfinals of Worlds or giving a speech in front of your mom?
Uh, I think at the time it was I think open quarters of worlds for sure because um I think at this point, January to April, I kind of knew I was bad. So negative feedback didn't really hurt that much. Open quarterfinals of worlds wasn't crazy nerve-wracking either because my goal was to quarterfinal worlds. So my goal was over. Octofinals, I was so scared. I was sweating the whole round. But quarters, I was like, yeah, I'm probably gonna lose. It's fine.
Yeah, we're gonna get there a little bit further. So, okay, you get to Team India. Mm, tell me about this whole experience and the championship year. What are the best moments?
Yeah. So Team India at World Schools is like an incredibly transformative experience for anyone who does it. Um, it's basically like so first, I mean, this is a privilege that we have that a lot of other countries don't, which is we don't have to pay anything, right? We don't have to pay for our travel or our accommodation or anything. It's covered by the nonprofit as well as by Ramco Systems, which is a company in India. And that's really big because like I couldn't afford to travel like to three international countries in this way, right? Um, and so the second thing is we get world class coaches. So between 2017 and 2019, the three primary coaches I had were Dhruva Bhatt, who debated on India a while back and then debated for Harvard. He was a top 10 speaker at Worlds. Varshini, who was the CA of the most recent World Schools, and Sayaka Islam, who was the top speaker of Australs in like 2007. And the three of them were like my primary coaches. And all of them at the time that I was on the team coached for free. Like they didn't take any pay for coaching. Right. And it was like really like transformative. It was also very hard. So it was a ton of hard work, like you would maybe expect a national team to be. So we would spend like so especially in the month prior to World Schools, we would basically spend a month. Everyone would fly to this office in Chennai, and we would spend a month basically 10 hours a day every single day that month, and we would do that for 2.5 months during the year, just every single day, almost no breaks. We would just work more than a full-time job for 2.5 months just doing debate. So for me, because of the way my school scheduled its calendar in such a way that for me specifically, it meant missing a month of school. Although for the others, it was often during their summer vacation. Um, and like so on top of that work, I would have to like catch up to study and stuff. So it was definitely very hard, but I have to say, like the returns to that training were unbelievable. Like I was progressing both as a debater and a person, like really, really rapidly and transformatively. Um, I mean, we took it super seriously. Um, I would probably say like winning World Schools in 2019 was, I mean, probably the joyous moment of all that time. because it felt like, it finally came to it. Like we finally got what we wanted. And we really did desperately want it for like a whole 3 years or something. So yeah, I think it was basically life changing, even outside of debate. Like my original plan was to go to college in India. And the main reason is like, I didn't know, like, so colleges in the US have financial aid, right? And that's based on need. Um, and I didn't know colleges in the US had financial aid. So I just saw the fees and was like, yeah, no way. I'm applying to colleges in India. And only, seeing other peers apply or seeing coaches who had went to college abroad, I realized, something like financial aid exists. I can apply for a scholarship or something. Um, and so like even being here in the college that I am in would not have happened without, being on that team. Yeah.
What is the best memory from that period for you?
Um, that's a good question. Uh I think there were some really powerful moments. Like, so I'll say two memories. One of them was, so there was this competition before World Schools in my final year. It was in Chennai. So ISDS was hosting their own international competition. It was called the Chennai Mini. So it was like 12 teams um, from around the world, that kind of thing. And I would say like, and this is the funny one, like pretty humorous. So we dropped in the semi. We dropped to Hong Kong, which was Schalke and others. And we were like coming back. And one of the things that the coaches wanted to work with me on is they noticed that they were scared that judges would kind of dislike the way I presented myself, because I would kind of walk up to the stage and stare really intently at them without realizing it and sound and look like I was about to kill them. And so we spent like, and like at world schools you really have to train everything. It's like training an athlete, right? You have to get the debating right, but you also have to get much more subtle things right as well. So I would say like, um so they basically spent 3-4 hours coaching me on like how to walk up the stage in a way that makes me look less like I want to kill the people in the audience, right? And that was like hilarious. Like even they knew it was hilarious. Like we were laughing throughout. And it was especially funny because at World Schools, which is what they were coaching me for, on day one, I broke my ankle, was wheelchair bound, and all that training went to waste because I was like coming in crutches from the wheelchair up to the stage and putting them down. So I would say like that's fairly humorous. In terms of like much more substantive moments, um, I mean I think uh there was this moment. So round seven of World Schools, we did okay, but we had some like squabbles as a team in prep, and then two of us were dealing with some mental health issues, and we kind of like blanked out during our speech, and it was kind of like a bad time, like between our team dynamic. And the thing about Team India is we are literally best friends, right? Like we are a really really tight team. So round seven of World Schools in my final year was a bit bad because we were squabbling in prep. We were feeling kind of bad, and then our coaches basically held this session for us before round eight of World Schools. Rather than giving us any feedback about the round, we spent an hour just saying like things we are grateful for about other people in the room. And I think that really like solidified our bond going into like elimination rounds. I think without that, we would have probably dropped in the first elimination round. So yeah, that was a really good moment.
If you had to explain to somebody who is a BP debater and hasn't done a bunch of world schools, like me, for example, what would you say is the main difference between world schools and BP? And not in terms of a format, but maybe in terms of feeling of the competition. What are people like? Something like this.
Yeah. Um, so there's a couple of things. One of them is you're representing your country, and that immediately makes it feel like the stakes are much higher. So even if you really deeply are invested in like a BP performance, like I was pretty invested at Worlds and so on, it's just an environment where the vast majority of people in the room are like really emotionally invested in this, or this has been like a really big fraction of their high school experience. it's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It has some positives. It also has some negatives, like maybe it's a little harder on your mental health. Um, the other thing that I would say is that when I did world schools, especially, um, there was a lot more emphasis on basically being disciplined about your speeches or about your debating. So, for example, your speeches, there would often be like your speeches have to be structured in a particular way that a lot of judges just expect. For example, a lot of judges used to just expect that you have a constructive argument at the end of a second speech, or that, yeah, just like there's less room for experimentation to some extent. And one of the reasons why is tied to the first thing, which is you don't want to take risks when you're representing your country, right? Like you're much less willing to take risks. And that leads to a lot of debaters being, a lot more disciplined, like the time allocation of their speeches, the structure of their speeches. It's a lot cleaner. Um, Again, it has some positives and negatives. Like the positives are like people mess up in terms of like fundamentally missing an important argument less, but at the same time there's less room for like lots of creativity or like giving first or fourth speeches as they were, that like occasionally get you those like 85s. Yeah, so in terms of debating, I would say that's the difference.
I think that's an interesting point of view in terms of the fact that, in my experience, a lot of, for example, debaters from the Balkans, they do feel like they're representing their country. It's less institutional than, let's say,
Mm,
the US or the UK, which I think is, now that we talk about it, an interesting perspective of how these communities are formed,
yeah.
and how do they work. Have you noticed something like this? Uh, Maybe more or less motivation. Of course, it's up to the individual, but if you had to do the comparison.
I would definitely say it's more motivation if you feel like you're representing your country. Again, there's a question of whether that more motivation is like good or bad for your mental health, but I think it's definitely there. Like obviously one of the constraints in like my institution is like half our world's team isn't from this country. Like we're all from like my partner is Australian and I'm Indian. Like it's hard for us to feel like we're a team representing one country. Although I did try very hard to acquire an Indian flag in Spain and failed. You know, yeah. So I buy that that might lead to like a lot more motivation. Yeah. Some people have like very strong institutional pride, uh, in like circuits that are more institutional. I do not. So
That
I
is,
mean, I
that is,
really care for the people on my team, but I don't particularly care about my university, if that makes sense.
yeah, fair enough. Well, Stanford, you have to earn your respect from the greats. You can't take them for granted. Okay, that's a good point to kind of transition to BP. So, um, you get into Stanford. Stanford, that's a big name. Um, how did that moment feel? Did you, in preparation for that, pull out from debating? Did you go there with the concept of I'm gonna continue debating, or was it a struggle to balance the two things?
So I didn't do almost any debating in my last year in school, just because there was so much work for like 12th standard, 12th grade, and yeah, I couldn't commit to Team India. And then of course the pandemic happened, like when I was in 12th grade. So I just did no debating that whole year. But I figured I was going to do debating coming into Stanford. I took a gap year. In the gap year, I did a bit of debating here and there. I also did like a bunch of like other projects, so I was quite busy. So coming in, I did want to debate. Only problem was, so my first year, all the tournaments were online. I love online debate. Like, I honestly, I might like it more than in person debate. Like, I just really enjoy the environment of an online tournament. The problem is, no one else at Stanford wanted to do online tournaments when I was a first year. And so I was basically left without a partner. So I went to the first tournament of the year, which was the HWSIV with Bhavya, who was a friend who was on Team India with me. And then I couldn't find a partner for a bunch of tournaments after that. Like I tried to go to Hart House, I tried to go to Cambridge. Um, I, I tried a lot of things, and I just couldn't find a feasible partner. And then I tried to go to Doxbridge and so on. And then Oxford, Oxford IB that year. I iron personed the tournament because I like really wanted to go, but I couldn't find a partner. I was like, yeah, I can't break, but I'll iron person. And that was pretty fun. And then I guess like I did a couple of tournaments when I started out, but the combination of me not having debated for a while, me adjusting to like a new environment, and not having a stable partner meant for the first semester, I did okay, but my speech quality went down a lot. Like even though the results looked okay, like I was breaking, I know the quality of my speeches, and I knew that like my speeches were a lot worse than they were before. And then I kind of gave up on looking for an institutional partner. I figured like, yeah, I'm not gonna go to Worlds. And then I just spent the next like 2 semesters basically going to tournaments with whoever would speak with me. Uh, I went to Leiden with Aniket. I went to Duke with Karthik. I just like picked up like I just asked a bunch of people, went to as many tournaments as I could. And then eventually the team started recovering. And so I had no idea. I really wanted to go to Madrid. I was like pretty annoyed I couldn't get to go to Belgrade, right? Um, to the point where I went to every pre-Belgrade tournament, and then I judged at Belgrade Worlds. And then I was like pretty convinced I wanted to go to Madrid Worlds. I had no idea who planned to go to Worlds, and so I just figured I would. So we have tryouts. So I just figured I would try out, see what happens. And then I didn't realize Vivian was going to try out. And then yeah, Vivian and I got put together, and Vivian is the best debate partner I've ever had. So yeah, worked out.
Shout out to Vivian, and I'm sure that after the debate here, you've had a lot of people would like to be in Vivian's place, but now I think you guys can do a lot of things while you're competing for Stanford. Uh, Having that in mind, you touched upon this a little bit, but what were the major things you struggled with going from world schools to BP?
Uh so I did a bit of BP in school as well. Like my first competition was BP. Um, I would say so. There was this period in world schools, where sometimes I would just like go into this mode when giving a world school speech, where I would like throw a lot of matter on the table and like rebut almost line by line, like do a lot of the things that BP debaters do that like world schools debaters don't really, like matter dump, be a bit unstructured. My coach used to call it courageous, like crazy, like I would just go crazy, and I had to like learn to rein myself in a lot, only make one argument rather than making four, like structure my speeches really really neatly. And to some extent I let loose in BP. So like the first semester of me doing BP at Stanford, I would often give like PM speeches with four arguments, like speaking at like 3 times normal human speed or something. It worked in a few rounds, um, but by and large it didn't work. And then I kind of over the past like 2022, I gradually developed this like style. I guess I figured out a style that worked for me, that like incorporated some of the elements of world schools. Like I don't think I speak crazy fast anymore, although I can speak fast if like the round demands it. um and like I usually have like some semblance of structure in my speech, but at the same time, like if I need to go crazy, I go crazy. Like it feels like a less reined in thing. But that was the biggest adaptation point, which is like figuring out how much I had to like be disciplined and control myself. The biggest area of discipline I do not have, even in world schools I didn't have, but I've especially lost it, is I'm so bad at allocating time within my speech. Like I always have two papers at the end of every speech of like notes that I didn't get to say. And so I've tried to get better at it, but at some point, my solution has just been do the important things first and then do the other stuff if you can do them later. But yeah, it's very, very hard. And like I kind of understand the impulse that a lot of debaters have to speak fast. Like I yeah, because there's just so much to say. And I'm like quite bad at the strategy part of debating. So
Yeah, that's one issue I never had with the speed. It's interesting now that you say. I do think a lot of debaters struggle with that particular issues, and I think it's regardless of the experience levels. I would say. Um, do you think there are some debaters that are really, really good at time management? And this is something that you kind of seen them as a very good example or a model way of behavior in terms of making use of their time.
yeah. I think there are like a couple of debaters who I've seen where it definitely feels like they almost have like 2 extra minutes in their speech with like how efficiently they're able to like put all the matter like that they need on the table. Um, the two that come to mind like most starkly for me are from like recent time, like across all the debaters whom I've debated against. So one of them is Harish. So I got the chance to debate against Harish a bunch when I was in high school in 2019. And he just has so much word economy. Like if you notice one of the tricks, he does pull one trick. Like if you actually pay attention to his speeches, which is if he has three responses to an argument, right? Or if he has four responses to an argument, he often does. By the way, he just never says it. So what he'll do is he'll say, setting aside the obvious problems that X and Y, and then he'll make two responses or one response. Or he'll be like, let's assume for a second that Y isn't true. And Y will be an entirely different response that he just slotted in there as a side note. Like if you pay close attention to his speeches, he does that all the time. Like, they say this, but like, let's just assume for a second that this assumption is true. Setting aside the fact that inserts the reason why the assumption is false. And he just has a lot of word economy. And, even like back when he was like active debating or doing worlds, like in 2010, 2011, or like this, that LSE final of his in 2012. Like he has that DLO in the LSE final. That is actually the most matter dense speech in the whole round. And like he was like being quite matter dense, even at a time when like being matter dense was not necessarily the norm. But he did it like it felt like he had extra time. The other speaker who comes to mind for more modern times, I actually have two more answers. I have two other speakers who immediately come to mind. One of them is Toby Liang, Ateneo. Uh, he rebuts everything, which is something like I also try to do, but I never get to everything and he does, and I don't know what his secret weapon is. Um, like, and that terrifies me. And then the other person who kind of does the same thing, and I have the same problem with, is Sophie Sheed from Sydney. Like whenever she has like a whip speech, she will cover every single argument the other side makes, and she also like speaks slow. Like I don't even understand how people like, is it just like command over the language? I don't know. It feels like a superpower.
That's absolutely true. I think it's a great skill to have in debating. So moving on to this whole BP World Schools transition. Now you're in BP. Um, you, as you said, struggled with finding a partner, then kind of figuring yourself out and how to do it BP. When did things first click? When did you realize, oh well, I'm actually pretty good at the thing?
So there's like an individual click and like a team click, right? So as an individual for me, I would say the biggest one was I got the opportunity to partner with DJ. So DJ is like was 2 years above me on Team India. He was the captain of Team India in my penultimate year. And then he was the assistant coach in my final year at WSTC. And then he debated for Hartas. So I had the opportunity to debate with DJ at the Johns Hopkins Open over the summer. I would say that's the first tournament where I felt like I was consistently good, in part because I had like DJ, who is like, in my opinion, one of the most underrated and one of the like best debaters in the world. And just like watching him prep and learning from him, and then like giving speeches, and then gradually reaching the point in the tournament where I was giving speeches as good as him, or like nearly as good as his speeches. For me, that was like a major clicking point, which is like, there are like particular, like I was just like spotting particular things that he used to do in prep. Like I'd never really been pro-ammed before. Like I never got that opportunity. So just seeing what that was like for me was like a major turning point for me. I would say for Vivian and me, um, so we had like a bunch of like various shaky tournaments and then good tournaments. But I would say like, so obviously we had like many good moments, right? So for example, the first concern that I had was that we wouldn't be good against competitive American teams. Then we went to the Yale IV and we managed to like, we were quite shaky, but we managed to put out some good performances. Then I was completely terrified that we would implode because, like, against the better European teams. Because, like, I mean, the best European teams are generally better than American teams, right? With some extent, like Europe is just like a more developed BP circuit. And so going to Oxford IV, I genuinely thought there was a risk that we wouldn't break, just based on like how much prep we had done, and I was like really scared. And so I think doing well at Oxford IV was like a really big confidence booster. However, at Oxford IV, we had a problem where we were terrible at like uh, back half. Like we struggled to find extension. And Oxford was our first tournament where we had to extend on like Matt and Ahmed, right? Like we had to extend on like really matter dense teams, or like Marta and George. Like we had to extend on like matter dense teams where it was like very difficult to come up with independent arguments. And so I would say the final point, which actually made me feel confident for Worlds, and probably the best tournament I've ever had as a speaker, like in terms of the quality of my speeches, was Structural Reasons. Um, like, so it was just like it was an online tournament. It was all night. We were in this exact room that I'm currently in. Like it was like through the night debating. And like that really felt like we were finally clicking because we had finally started like prepping intensively together. And I would say that was both by far our best tournament as a team and also by far my best tournament ever as a speaker. Except, like, obviously, we completely collapsed in the semi. Like, I don't know what we were doing in the semi. Like, we gave like a pair of 77s or something. We were very bad. But except for the semi, I think it was like our most stably good tournament ever. Yeah. So I would say that's like the real like inflection point.
Who would you say is the most underrated debater?
The most underrated debater. The thing is, I don't know how well debaters are rated by general people, so I can just like make guesses. So I mean, let me just first name two people whom I know. One of them is DJ. The biggest problem for DJ, I think, is that he only did one Worlds when he was a second year and before he got really good. And then he didn't get to do Korea Worlds because it got moved to the summer, and his partner had something over the summer. But in the season before Korea Worlds, DJ won the North American NAUDC, the North American VP Championships. He broke top 15 out of 15 at the Oxford IV. He placed fifth at the HWS round robin. So he had like a really intensively good year. And just seeing him debate, obviously, like I'm biased because he's a friend, but like debating with him or seeing him debate, genuinely I see like one of the best debaters I've debated with or against. And like I've debated with a lot of really good people, and I feel like definitely it's underappreciated how good he is. Like he averaged 84 at JHU or something, like his first return tournament after 2 years or something. And then the other person whom I know and I believe is really underrated is my coach Dhruva. um Dhruva is the most challenging debater I've ever debated against. I think his problem was, so he did quite well in the run up to his final worlds. In the run up to Dutch worlds, he finaled the Oxford IB, he won Yale, he won HWS, he finaled USUDC, he finaled NAADC, he did a bunch of that stuff. Um, and then at worlds, he broke sixth. He was the top 10 speaker, but he drew CG on that motion this house would ban religious advocacy in public places. and didn't go through. And the only CG that went through was Dan and Ayal, right? Like that, it's a hard CG when the only CG going through is Dan, Lahav, and Ayal. Um, and then he basically left debate after that. And I guess the one piece of evidence I have for like, and even though he left debate, he like did a lot of like practice against us when we were on Team India, and it felt like he was still improving. So by 2019, it felt like he was a much better debater than he was even when he was the seventh best speaker in the world. But he didn't do much debating at that point. Like he didn't go to tournaments anymore. And so I don't think the world got to see like Dhruva at his best form. He went to one tournament. He went to the LSE Open in 2019. He made finals of like a very competitive LSE Open. But apart from that, he didn't go to any tournaments. So yeah, those were the two people who I know who I would say are like super underrated. In terms of, I don't know if we're out of time for my answer. So I mean, if you want, yeah.
I think we can say a lot of things, but I have to ask the more interesting question. Who is the most overrated debater?
I would have to say like, I would have to say Shengwu Li. Like, and like, I mean, this is not necessarily a super controversial opinion anymore, but like, if he debated today, he might be great. Like, he's obviously like a very smart person. But the speeches of his that actually exist from 2010 to 2009 are not that good, in part because a lot of the arguments that he was making, like he was the person who popularized the arguments in debating, right? So there's a lot of like, the responses to the social contract, like which they exist in philosophy for a while, but at the time he was doing philosophy, so he kind of made them much more popular in debating. And we've obviously had like 13 years of listening to his speeches, and all his arguments have now become stock arguments. And like the average debater who's watched a couple of his videos can make those arguments better. So it's like, it's sort of just a chronological thing. The fact that he had to debate in 2010, like maybe if he debated today and got used to the norms and stuff, he would be really good. But like, he is often considered the GOAT based on his speeches that exist on the internet right now. And I think that's wrong.
Then who is the GOAT?
Uh, I don't think there's a clear answer to this question. Um, there are lots of people. I think the answer that I've roughly arrived at somewhere in my head. Well, like I roughly agree with Ruman's answer on like his interview, which is like there are like goats of different skills, and there are obviously things about speakers from the past that we haven't seen, and it's very hard to like pick one. If I had to pick one, like one team from throughout debating history that like completely terrifies me, is Chinwe and Jason. I think they won the best worlds of all time. Like that itself is like sufficient to like put them quite clearly in that category. So in terms of teams, I would go maybe Chinwe and Jason, or maybe Art and Abhinav who broke top, or like Tin and Luca, like that set of teams who did really well at that worlds. For an individual speaker, I can't tell you who the GOAT is because I don't know, but I would say the best. So I have a theory for what the best performance at a single tournament was by a single speaker. And I suspect, based on the information that we have, that that was Danny Dubois at the round robin in 2017. So he top spoke the round robin twice, once in 2017 and once in 2019. But in 2017, there are 4 of his recorded speeches online, and I do encourage watching them. I think every one of his recorded speeches is like an 84 plus speech. And that's a level of consistency for 4 consecutive rounds at a 6 round tournament. I don't think I've seen that ever before or after. So if I had to have a theory for like the best performance at one tournament by one person, my guess would be it would be Danny Dubois at the round robin in 2017. But I don't, that's not a good answer, but that's the best I can provide.
I had a conversation recently because obviously, like, we've started having this conversation. We have this show now, which is a platform on its own. Do you think it will become more and more of an evident problem that there is certain level of subconscious biases in our community regarding how we evaluate and remember certain types of speakers. So, for example, women ESL speakers uh, in the history of things when we have the gold conversations.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it seems very likely that especially from the past, like ESL and women speakers aren't brought up in goat conversations. Um, One reason for this is like there's obviously a selection effect where often the types of rounds that they were prominently in aren't recorded, or in many cases the break was sufficiently biased that some of the best debaters of the time like didn't break open at Worlds somehow, or like and like a lot of the best teams who are ESL had that struggle for a while, right? So for example, Dan and Ayal of course made semis of Worlds in 2016 itself, but like one simple observation about them is that if you look at the majors that aren't worlds, if you look at Oxbridge, if you look at Euros, if you look at the round robin, those types of tournaments, Dan and Ayal were like consistently top 10 speaking. But neither of them made it to the top 30 of worlds until the worlds where they top two spoke, for example. So it feels like there was a fairly sharp like rise there. And then there are some like really great ESL speakers of the past, like you know, Stefan and Helena. Like, I'm not sure there are any Worlds outrounds of them recorded. I don't even know if they broke open at Worlds. I mean, maybe they did. Honestly, I just don't know much about debating from that period. But if you actually look at their speeches, they seem like a team that would break open at Worlds now, and almost certainly should have broken open at Worlds then. Uh, so I definitely think, like, especially given like one of the consequences of there being some progress in like the involvement of debaters from like ESL backgrounds or women is like um a lot more of their recordings and stuff exist from much more modern debaters than they did from the past. There was like a what 8-year gap for a women top speaker again, like after L Jones it was Hadar like 8 years later. Yeah.
If you had to pick one partner from every debate partner, obviously, like Vivian is great, so we are removing Vivian from the conversation. Let's say Vivian is busy that summer and you have to go to Worlds and it's your final Worlds. You can pick any partner from any place that you want. Who would you pick?
This is so hard. This is an impossible question.
And I don't want answers of like friends who you have because you're closer. Imagine that you have time to have work with that person in both ways.
Sorry, I'm confused. But I didn't understand that. Like, presumably, debating with a friend is different than hanging out with a friend, right?
Yeah, exactly. I just don't want a cop out answer. I don't want to say to you to say just a friend because
Oh, but I
it's
was going
like
to say a friend. Sorry, like, or are all my friends busy?
your all of your friends are busy.
Okay,
I
got
want
it.
something.
That
I
makes it
want
much
a more
easier, to be
interesting
honest.
answer.
That makes it substantially easier. All my friends are busy. So who's someone I don't really know who I would want to debate with? Uh, and what should I picking be based out of? Should I be like optimizing for my chances of doing well at Worlds? Like, what should I be doing?
Well, of course. Don't you want to win worlds?
Sure,
It's
but
your
like
last
I
world.
also care about the experience. Like Worlds running with someone is like quite an investment of time and energy, and you have to enjoy it, right?
Yeah, but since you're picking out of people that you don't know that well anyway, you can't really
Okay, fair.
factor that in
So I just
the
have to pick someone
conversation.
who I would go. Okay, so I would probably have to pick someone who is good at strategy and very good at extension, because um I speak whip, and on front half we get to prep and like exchange the case a lot, while on back half we don't. And I'm terrible at strategy, so it would have to be someone who's good at strategy. Uh, this is tough. So I think like a lot of the greatest extension speakers I can think of are people I know. Like possibly the greatest, yeah, like if I think of like a really good strategic extension speaker, the first person I think of is Naomi. But Naomi is eliminated from this conversation. So who else? I should probably pick someone from the past. Who are some extension speakers who were incredible in the past? Hmm. MDG, I guess. There's this extension speech of his from the LSE Open in 2018. It's about the rise of e-health websites. One of the best extension speeches I've ever seen.
Okay, that's that sounds like a good answer. I've heard good things about MDG. Okay, so what's your experience in terms of dealing with your mental health during tournaments such as Worlds? You mentioned already a story of how you dealt with a particular moment during your World Schools career, uh, which I think is a really good shout out to your coaches, because I do think that was a great move to do when you're seeing that something in the team is not working. I do think that when you get to a certain level, you are essentially much more impacted by your mental state and how you're approaching these issues than actually whether you know of the best arguments or you have the best speeches. So, how do you approach this issue?
Um, yeah, it's definitely a work in progress. Um, So a lot of people, so one piece of advice that I don't necessarily agree with that a lot of people give is like, remember that debating is just a game, that kind of thing. That's true, but like it's a game that you've chosen to dedicate a lot of time to, like any other sport. And so it's completely valid for debate to be like super meaningful for someone. So for me in particular, like if someone's mental health advice is don't care about it that much, it's just a game, it's not going to work for me. Because I know it's a game, but it's a game I've invested a lot of time in, somewhat arbitrarily, somewhat subjectively. So it's like, just like, I don't know, someone who plays a sport for their college or something, right? So in terms of more substantive stuff, I would say, um, so for me, there are two types of mental health problems that often arise. One of them is I am at risk for, so basically, I likely have, I'm not sure, probably some kind of PTSD or something. And so I need to insulate myself against the risk of that ever reappearing during a debate round or a debate tournament. So for that, I just like do a lot of the standard tasks of like trying to get my mind away from trauma, that kind of thing. That's never really been a big problem for me. The other problem, of course, is like the stress of going to a tournament itself. I don't have a stress management system per se, but to some extent, just like being around with friends, ensuring I'm eating healthy and getting enough sleep, um, you know, picking playlists that will calm me down in between rounds, that kind of thing helps a lot. The final thing, and I'm actually like super disciplined during tournaments. Like I always eat healthy and I always sleep on time and get enough sleep. And then the final thing is, I am one of those people for whom talking about the debate is like a good way to calm myself down. Like even if I massively messed up, just talking through the round and thinking about what happened, I realize it's not necessarily the healthiest approach for most people, but for me, just being able to have that reflective space where I'm thinking about the round in a context where I'm removed from it, I know it's already happened, has a calming effect on me. Uh yeah, so like an example is like the world's quarter, like I knew we were the fourth, it was quite obvious. Um and like I kind of just calm myself down by like spending some time thinking about, how we could have improved that extension or something.
So you seem very easy about not making it to semis to finals, because I know a lot of debaters when they go to these major tournaments and they're one of the, let's say, I mean, I wouldn't say like favorites. I don't know what favorites are. There's different opinions, but you're definitely did very well before Worlds. So you had certain level of expectations on yourself to perform well. And I think it's hard to kind of say I'm happy with what I've achieved. Many people um, don't share the same sentiment. They have certain level of regrets, which is, I think, normal. But you seem to be in a good space regarding that. How how did you get to this mindset? Do you think it's going to get worse over time? So if you don't achieve better next year, it's going to be much different, or we'll just say, I mean, that's life. What's your approach to this?
I think it's probably going to get worse over time, for sure. But um, so I guess there were like roughly three things that helped. One of them is um, so Vivian and I had set ourselves a very clear goal for how we wanted to perform at this World, which is we wanted to break protected and we wanted a quarter. So we thought about these goals a lot. We spent some time thinking about what would be a realistic goal for us. What should we be striving toward? We decided first that we shouldn't strive toward any speaker award because like speaks kind of one speak can push you up or down. Like one random judge can give you a 65 or something. Like yeah. So we decided we're not going to consider speaks, right? So we had two very specific goals to evaluate ourselves and to benchmark for us, which was breaking protected and quarterfinaling. We set these goals for ourselves in September and we didn't change them. And so coming into Worlds, that was very much embedded in my head. So, for example, I was really nervous during break night, even though I knew we almost certainly, based on the back tab, I knew that we almost certainly had broken because I really wanted to ensure we broke top 16. And like, I think I was more stressed about this than a lot of the other people who knew they would break. Because for a lot of people, right, if you don't break protector, it's fine, I just debate an extra round. But for us, it was one of our preset goals, right? And so break night was one point, and then the other was the octo. Like we were, I mean not we. I was really scared during the octo because like that was like a do or die moment of whether I achieve my other goal or not. Not necessarily the most healthy. So what I would say is the thing which helped the most is once we reached those two goals, the two check boxes that I ticked, in my head I was like, yeah, like the goal is accomplished. Now let me just debate as well as possible and have fun. So I guess in terms of like being okay with going out in quarters, it's just because I guess I set a more realistic goal or something beforehand. So it's not necessarily like I'm super healthy at processing defeat or something. It's just like I met my goal. So I was like, yeah, ticked the objective. Got like I just set my eye on the ball basically, which is I needed to make quarters. And once I did, I was cool. And then like the other thing is like walking into the quarter, like we knew we were not one of the two best teams in that room. Uh, and so it would take some amount of luck or some really good performance from us or something to go through. And so just kind of like by the end of the quarter, I mean, obviously, like there's a difference between going out and then going out in the hard fourth, the way we went out. But coming in, I wouldn't say we necessarily expected to go through either. Like we knew we had like a pretty rough draw. So I just think we decided to, enjoy ourselves. Uh, in terms of future worlds, yeah, I think it's likely going to involve setting higher goals. So obviously, it's going to be like something discussed with a partner. And so if I don't meet that, I would probably be moderately sad. But I do think I'm good at like getting over bad debate performances. Sometimes I like dwell on them. I'm like, God, I should have done this round in this different way. But I don't necessarily feel super sad about them. The other thing is Viv is one of the chillest people in the world, like about debating. So she was really calm throughout the competition, regardless of what the result was, and just having that anchor there. So I was definitely the angsty one between the two of us. And so just having that anchor was really helpful for my own mental health as well.
What is one thing you hate about debating?
Structural reasons, man. Okay. Like in but like being more serious, I think I hate it when debating is like completely unanchored from reality, or like when people make arguments that are obviously not going to happen in the real world. I hate debate land. That's what I hate. Like I think debate land reduces the value of this activity, because yes, this activity is a game, and the part of the activity that's a game is excellent, but it should also be a game that's educational or that teaches you something about real world problems. Like we think of ourselves as wanting to discuss real world issues, and to that end, whatever extent that debate land exists kind of pisses me off. The other thing is, and like I actually complained about this in a speech once. I think that like, so structural reasons are very good. And the reason they're often better than things like examples and stuff is because an example is just one case, right? Whereas a logical argument can apply to many cases, or it can apply to a blanket of cases. So I completely agree that logical arguments are excellent, probably better than examples. But I do think like, in order for debate to be more anchored to the real world, it does have to be a format that treats evidence and examples seriously, the rules say it does. Like I think the world's manual is actually pretty excellent. But like in practice, like it has to be a format that treats examples and evidence seriously. It has to be a format that doesn't accept lying. Like debaters lie so much, and it's so annoying. I genuinely try my best to not lie. Like I may get a fact wrong, but if I don't know an example, I never make one up. I just don't say an example. I just lose the round. Because for me, it's just like, firstly, for me, it improves my debating. Because if I feel like I have to lie, losing the round is better for me, because then I go learn about it. And the next time I have to debate it, I'm way better. And then the other thing is, it just feels off. Like it just feels like, yeah, I would say debate land and like is the thing that annoys me the most.
What's your favorite debate speech and debate round?
Uh, there are a lot. Um, I think the speech, I would say like the two debate speeches that, okay, so the two debate speeches that I watched that I found the strongest that are on the internet, or like into just in terms of their quality. One of them is Tin's LO in the octo final of Doxbridge 4. It's about whether Black Lives Matter should incorporate Black liberation theology into its like um, platform. And I would say that LO was really good. And then the other is Danny DeBois' Gov Whip at the 2017 round robin round 5. It's about the US issuing guest worker visas. So just in terms of quality, I would say those. But I also think I have like attachments to speeches that are sort of independent of their quality, like speeches that, in my view, you know, make a really important point about the world, or they address like a really important question, or, you know, they just move me in some way. I would say like your and Ruman's extension in the Euros final, I mentioned this to you earlier, but it really moved me because I'm like, I kind of hate how common anti-natalism is in debaters. And I think we need a bit of like also arguments that appreciate the amount of value that life provides in itself. And I think that extension just like, yeah, like it moved me to tears when I first saw it. Um, and then I would say, yeah, that's what comes to mind right now.
So, I think one last question I have for you. You've already mentioned you really enjoy online tournaments. Which has been your favorite online tournament and why?
Ah, that's a good question. Yeah, I have an answer though. I would have to say my favorite one was the Effective Altruism Debating Championship in 2020. I did it with one of my closest friends, Karthik. The two of us at the time, especially me, like he had like a proper debate resume. He was a fourth year in college. I had no debate resume outside of schools, and we were both like, especially me, I was not very good, right? Like I averaged like 78.8 or something. Like I was not like I was okay, but I was not very good. Um, but the topics were all effective altruism themed. And the two of us knew a lot about effective altruism. Like we'd spent a lot of time around the community, we'd heard about it, we'd read a ton about issues like animal welfare and development and AI and that kind of thing. And so it was just really fun because first it was debating with one of my closest friends, and that itself is really fun. But I debate with some of my closest friends all the time. But the part of it that made it like especially a good memory was that even though in terms of the quality of our debate speeches, we were not necessarily giving the best speeches. Like as debaters, like as a team, there's no way we could like match up to Tekwei and Shishti who won the competition, or like Naomi, or like the tournament was like really stacked, right? And there's no way we could match up to most of those teams. But we made the open final anyway, just because we knew stuff, just because it was it was our domain, and it just kind of convinced me that like it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is if debate is an activity that rewards people who know about a subject and who like read about it or something, then it feels like debate has accomplished its goal of like rewarding actually persuasive arguments. So in that philosophical sense, it was nice, but it was also just nice to make a final because it was topics we enjoyed debating, even if we were worse debaters than a lot of the other teams at the tournament. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's the great way to end the questions. And before I kind of make the end credits and end the show, I would like to do this thing at the end of these things, which is give you the platform, do whatever you want with it, talk about anything that you want, pause a conversation, send a message, plug something if you're doing something in your life. It's all about you.
I don't have anything to plug, but if you want to donate to something, I recommend donating to the Humane League. Related to the animal welfare discussion we were having earlier, the Humane League basically works on corporate outreach and corporate campaigns that convince companies to improve their animal welfare standards. So far, they've been a pioneer of cage free campaigns, which is convincing companies to only buy eggs if the hens that lay the eggs are not kept in battery cages. And now one of their most important campaigns is working on ensuring broiler chickens, that is, chickens that are raised for meat, don't have those like really fast growth hormones put into them that cause them to grow really large really quickly, that cause a lot of injuries and distress during their lives. So if you're looking for a donation or a way to like advance the animal welfare issues we were talking about earlier, the Humane League, highly recommended.
Well, there you have it. One of the debaters with the biggest hearts I know. Somebody who will achieve, I believe, great things. Obviously, if you've gotten to this stage, why not leave a comment, like, subscribe, all of these bullshit things that content creators do. You can do it here because apparently now I'm starting this, so I'm watching all the analytics and stuff. It's better, but it's better not because I want to get famous. It's better because these conversations are fun and more people should get to experience them. Thank you very much for being my guest. It was truly an honor, and I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, especially the debating part.
Thank you so much for having me.